Brilliant. Love it.
All right, here we go. Hey everybody, Dan Shinder here on Drum Talk TV live, if you're watching it live. Otherwise, you're watching it on the archive, and we were live before. I'm here with our first time guest here on, well, coming up on 6 years of Drum Talk TV, Mr. Pete Lockett, coming from London. I'm in a small town of Globe, Arizona, 100 miles east of Phoenix, 120 miles north of Tucson. Tell us where you're watching from. And while you do that, folks, I will bring us up on the monitor so I can do a couple things here. And we may even take some questions from the audience as well. And as you can tell by the list of artists that, well, a brief snippet of lists of artists on the video player that Pete has worked with, you probably get a hint, whether you're familiar with his playing or not, that he's very versatile. Pete, first of all, how are you?
Hey Dan, great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for making time. I know it's much later in the day there. Really appreciate it.
That's all good. Nice to see you got a big display of percussion stuff behind you. Mini percussion.
Maybe we'll even jam. One of the things that fascinates me about your playing and your talent is that it's the epitome of versatility and diversity, really, in different styles of music, different genres, the list of the different players that you've played with, and not just in pop music. You know, you've got the music that you've really immersed yourself in North and South India, all the way to Taiko drumming, which I'm a huge fan of. About 15 years ago, I used to do some Taiko troupe drumming, which I just absolutely love, all the way to North Africa. I mean, the list goes on and on. My first question is, what initially and when sparked your interest in things way beyond four on the floor or even progressive or jazz drumming on a drum kit to really get into so many other different hand drumming and taiko type drumming?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of accidental, really, in many aspects. I mean, first of all, I'd like to say, you know, I come from a very multicultural city. You know, London's a very diverse city culturally, so there are many different musicians from all over the world here, you know, like from Japan and India and China and Africa and many different countries. We're very lucky to have people from so many countries, you know, with us in London. It's actually very humbling to be involved in, you know, some of their cultures and some of their amazing musical traditions and everything that comes with it. But in actual fact, me getting exposure, I mean, I started quite late. I started at 19 as a punk rock drummer.
Oh, wow, that's right, yeah.
Which was my hometown. And then I moved to London and, you know, as a rock drummer, I mean, literally a year later. And then quite by chance, one day I came across a free concert in London, and it was the great master Zakir Hussain and the late great Ali Akbar Khan. And, you know, it was a mind-blowing gig to see if you've never seen that music. Yeah. And then, you know, a couple of months later, I lived in Tottenham in North London. A newspaper came through the front door and had fallen open on the mat, and there was a big advert for tabla lessons. So that's kind of how I got into it. Initially, just to complement my drum set playing, but in actual fact, the all of the playing techniques, all of the musical formalities, and everything about, you know, Indian percussion, Indian music, and tabla, and you know, in comparison to what we have in the West with drum set and different other, you know, percussion, was so different that it was very hard to find a bridge to build. It took me many years to build those bridges between, you know, like the Indian rhythmic traditions and the Western.
Absolutely. And I want to show everybody a snippet of one of your videos playing an instrument I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about, and that's the tabla drum. And drummers and other musicians out there watching, if you've never attempted to play this drum, it's hard to quantify the difficulty that it takes to. I think the tabla and probably the mridangam might be the most difficult percussion instruments to master. So let me see if I can find the right tab and bring this video up. And Pete, you won't hear it. Oh, that's the hybrid drum kit. We'll show that one in a minute. You won't hear it, but the audience will hear it, and then we'll talk about it. So here we go, folks. The instrument just absolutely fascinates me. And
Yeah.
what I want to ask you is, in watching your fingering and everything, I know this is going to sound like a naive question because it really is.
Yeah.
I play the steel tongue drum, and I'm always amazed by how much sound you can get out of it without a lot of strength. But it looks to me like you need to use a lot of finger strength to get the sounds out of the tablas that you do. Is that true, or is it?
You need momentum, but you don't need that physical force to play the drum. It's almost like you're bringing the sounds out of the drum rather than putting them in.
That's interesting. And it looks like am I correct that a lot of the fingering is almost like tapping and snapping? Is that correct?
There's no snapping. No, you get snapping in a lot of frame drumming. It looks like snapping, but it's not. And sometimes when you get students coming in for their first lesson who have watched tabla, they'll try and flick their fingers like this. But that's not at all. There's nothing. There's no snapping whatsoever that happens with the tabla. It's all free movement of the fingers.
Yeah. And how did you get into the tabla? And did you work with somebody to study the instrument at first? It doesn't.
Well, yeah, that's
like
what I saw the advert for the lessons and went down.
Yeah.
And that was it. I was hooked because it's so it draws you into its world. It's everything about it is enchanting and different, and
Right.
there's mysteries around every corner with the instrument. And so once you've started with it, you're kind of like pulled into this world of discovery. Both rhythmic and technically, and even to get some of the sounds, like the basic sounds, like the na sound on the rim of the drum, or the tun, or to get the open bass sound, glissando. A lot of these things that it actually takes years even to make the sounds properly, let alone start to build the compositions together.
And you mentioned a key word, which is enchanting. And to me personally, the music of North Africa and the rest of that Middle East region, you pick any country and the music really is enchanting. When I'm working in my office here, if I don't need my ears for work, I'll put on music. And a lot of times I'll put on just hours of YouTube playlists of Moroccan music and Arabian music, and it is indeed, and Egyptian music. It's so enchanting is the perfect word. Absolutely.
Well, certainly, when you go to India, you come across instruments like the tabla and
Right.
Mridangam from the south, and even if you start to look at all of the literally thousands of folk drums that you get across the country, with interesting and different techniques, the way they hold the sticks and the way the drums are played and tuned, it's a never-ending journey of discovery, throughout your whole life.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of musicians, not just drummers and percussionists, but I think that there's a lot of musicians that are possibly missing out by just sort of staying in a box of stuff they know and stuff they're comfortable with, and even when it comes to just listening to it. Whereas if you don't live in a place, like I grew up in Los Angeles, kind of the same dynamic as London when it comes to a melting pot of cultures. New York, different places like that around the world. If you don't live in an area like that, it's so important to either get out and travel and get somewhere else and immerse yourself in other cultures, or this amazing thing called YouTube that they didn't have when we were kids. And you can really expose your horizons to just about anything, and which leads me to the way you've incorporated, for instance, the Indian rhythms to the drum set playing.
Oh, just coming back to what you've just said before we go on to the next question, is that it really it's a matter of personal choice, really. I think it's great. Right. For me, it's a great journey to go on to discover, different traditions, and that suits my personality and my inquisitiveness. But some people, focus on one area, and I think that's totally fine as well. Whatever kind of route people take through the musical world is fine. Some
Absolutely.
people specialize in heavy rock or fusion or different things, and totally dedicate their lives to perfecting that, which I think is totally cool. And other people maybe want to widen the horizons and mix different things. The other thing to bear in mind with that is the more you widen your horizons and open up to many different things, the smaller your market becomes. This is another crucial fact of the matter, that the more diverse you become, the less of an audience you have.
That's true. A great example of that is the big shift that happened towards the end of the 70s and moving into the 80s, the epic works by bands like Yes and ELP and Genesis. Let's take Tales from Topographic Oceans for a moment. It's a double album, 4 sides. It's one story, and each side is one composition. Yeah. Moving into the 80s, and I was playing in a progressive rock band, somehow still getting gigs up and down the Sunset Strip in Hollywood, but all of a sudden you had to either pick and wear a skinny tie and do the new wave thing, or do the punk thing, or wear spandex, and I did have great hair then, and do all the hairspray, or you were out. And we were stubborn, snobbish, stuck in our ways. No, we want to play music you can't possibly dance to, or you'll hurt your hip. And we kind of got squeezed out of the scene because we were so stuck. And it's sort of the same.
Well, that's partly because, the way the music, the way the music industry works is it's almost entirely about fashion and sales, fad fashion sales and
commercialization,
success and failure. It's not really so much about the music
or the art.
It's or the art. I wouldn't use a word. I mean, the art, but it can come across as a pretentious thing to say. But
that's true.
It's about what the role that music has in the society, and the role is commodity. That's the position that we're in the world, is that the music world that we find ourselves in is about sales and commodity, and fashion, fad, and so that's why I think it's very important for musicians to be able to realize what their love and their passion is, because a lot of musicians are pulled towards chasing success or chasing what's popular. And at the end of the day, you're going to be a happier musician. Maybe some might not succeed, but do what you love and stick, rigorously to that, regardless of the consequences of, the rewards that you won't get, because the best music comes from you when you make the music that you love, and not the music you feel pressured to by your external, society.
Absolutely. And that is platinum advice, no pun intended. I think for all musicians, whether you're playing the corner pub on weekends and you work a 9-to-5 blue or white collar job during the week, or you're pushing to get that next big record deal distribution, that same rule absolutely applies. You got to feel the joy first, and it's got to be genuine. And your music's always better when it's genuine too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Let's talk about how you incorporated the Indian rhythms for drum set in that book, and then I'll play a little bit of that clip of you at the hybrid drum kit to kind of tie in.
Yeah. So I mean, it actually, like I say, in earlier on, it took me a long time to incorporate the Indian, incorporate an approach, which kind of brought the two together, and I guess it came about out of education, and I kind of boiled it down to kind of a basic kind of set of procedures. So first of all, you have the phonetics with a clapping cycle, and then you would orchestrate that. The phonetics maybe to begin with a sticking on the snare drum, and have the clapping cycle with the feet, and then you would go on to orchestrate it. And then also beyond that is like zooming out of the whole Indian kind of rhythm overview. What's important to me in educational terms is to be able to teach people the principles behind it. So it's not like everyone's going to go off and study tabla and be an expert in Indian rhythm. But what we can do is look at some of the principles, some of the fundamental systems that they have in place to develop their rhythmic work along the timeline. Modulation or partitioning and mathematics, theme and variation, stuff like that. So to be able to kind of put these ideas and demonstrate these ideas to drummers and percussionists who aren't familiar with the Indian thing, to be able to, use those ideas and bring them into their own world and develop their music with some of those, approaches.
Absolutely. And I love how they bridge together and fit, and what the possibilities are. Is the book still available online and in music stores typically?
Yeah. There's the Indian Rhythms for the drum set is available on Hudson Music, and there's a new one which is called Bars, Beats and Building Blocks, which is also on Hudson Music.
Great.
And that's kind of, it's almost a beginner's guide to it's not specifically Indian, but it's looking at a lot of those components, and I've stripped away the syllables and just put counting in, so to make that, to make the doorway into it even easier.
Great. Let's take a look at a clip of you playing a hybrid drum kit, and if it's okay, after we watch some of that, you can tell us about the kit and about that love for that type of playing, okay?
Yeah.
Here we go. As soon as it comes up. There we go. I love that. I just think it's fascinating.
Of course, I haven't heard it, so I don't know which bit it is.
Yeah, it's the one.
I know the piece that is, yeah, from the group drum festival, the Afro Drum Festival.
Yeah, it's the one that you sent on. Oh, no, I'm trying to get it to stop. There we go. It's the one that you sent on the hybrid drum kit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you set up a kit like that, again, another kind of naive question, because I know everybody has their different approach, and some people will just throw something together, not really throw it together, but just put something together to try out and get comfortable with it. And sometimes a kit like that is put together extremely strategic. Did you go through different iterations of that setup, or does it change all the time, or is it something that's morphed over the years?
To bear in mind is that it's, as a percussionist, I'm literally having different setups all the time. Right. So in some situations it's just a percussion setup, and in some situations it's just a kind of drum set style setup. But in many situations they're combined, and so particularly with the percussion drum set mix, you'd end up having that 12x2 bass drum, which is where the small tom is. So with that kit that you were watching, there's no bass drum with the foot, and that style of playing actually comes from a lot of Indian percussionists, because if you look at the way that Indian drums are played, take for example the dol drum, DHOL, Punjabi dol, which is a double-ended drum, big drum. You got like a small thin stick on the treble end and a fat curved stick on the bass end. Now a lot of the patterns involve only the left hand on the bass end and only the right hand on the treble end, or the strong hand and the weak hand. And so within the Indian percussionist's mind is this idea of having like the bass drum just played with one hand and a lot of action on the treble drum. If you strip that down and start to look at other Indian drums, such as the tabla, it's kind of the same premise, but a little bit more complicated in the sense that you've got a lot of different finger movements on the open bass drum, with one hand, and a lot of treble stuff on the other hand. So this idea of having a bass drum with one hand is very common in India. A lot of Indian percussionists use, what they would call a hand kick. Now, going on from that, one of the people that made that most famous to the West was the great Trilok Gurtu, the great innovator of, interesting drum set ideas, and an amazing, genius in music, in composition, and in the rhythms that he made. So he had a kit that was, he used to sit on the floor and play the kit. And to rewind a little bit with me, in the beginning, my setups were all on the floor. Oh. And so that's where the idea of not using a bass drum with your foot comes from, because you're kind of filling in a gap by being set up on the floor. Mm-hmm. So that just gets extended now. It's raised, and it's a great it's a great kit, because one of the things that is most important about that for me is that I can easily access all of my percussion vocabulary in a way that I can't on the regular drum set.
Very interesting. And there's a gentleman, actually, it's funny, I just out of the corner of my eye saw him message me, and I'm asking him to tune in right now, because he is in southern India, and he plays the Gatham clay pot drum, as I know you do. Yep. And he's been sending me a lot of videos lately. One second here. a lot of videos of him playing the tawil drum, which is played with like a stick on one end of the drum, and the other side, I forgot what they're called, but it's the caps that he's wearing on his fingers, and the rhythms he gets going are just amazing, and that sound of that drum as well is amazing.
The repertoire is very similar to the mridangam, the actual some of the patterns and stuff like that, and of course the actual rhythmic repertoire, because that's you could call that a classical South Indian drum. The rhythmic repertoire, such as the compositions and the rhythmic structures and stuff like that, is unified with all of the classical drums. So Gatam, Tawil, Kanjira, Morsing, Mridangam, vocal percussion, Konakol or Solkatu. So, it's actually they're all very interlinked.
Yeah, and the patterns, like if I'm pronouncing it right, I hope, especially with you on the line right here, that Carnatic, vocal drumming and singing along with drums. Did you work?
It's an amazing world. It's an amazing world, and when you really start to delve into it, this is goes back 600-700 BC. So we've got a very ancient lineage, unbroken lineage of developed percussive ideas, and for us not to tap into that, is a bit of a wasted opportunity. It's such a huge gold mine of rhythmic information. And actually, what I would say is, I'm just like a beginner with it. When you look at the masters, they are literally, honestly, from a different planet with the ability that they have. When
Absolutely.
You look at, certainly some of the young players coming up now that you're seeing, some of the Konakol artists and some of the different players from South India, but also some of the older artists, like on the Tawil, for example, Palani Vale is just like an unbelievable master of the drum. And when you see them play, when I saw him do a solo, I was lucky enough to play at a memorial for Zakir Hussain's father in Mumbai with the family, and also playing was Palani Vale, and he did a solo, and I think it was about an hour long, and he started off. There's someone clapping time with some bells, just in 8/4 Adi Tal it's called, and he played a solo like 8 in the space of 8. 9 in the space of 8, 10 in the space of 8, 11 in the went up to 16 with complete freedom in every single, but the quarter note stays the same throughout. Just mind-blowing virtuosity. When Steve Smith played in the same gig, I think the next year, he was in tears listening to the drummers play. So it's just literally, it's ridiculous, like unbelievable stuff goes on there.
It really is, and something very interesting you pointed out that really lends itself to some keen perspective, and that is here in the last, well, let's just say since 1900, we've had some genres of music come about. There's been jazz, and then jazz has branched out and spoked out and morphed into different, types of jazz, and then rock came along in the 50s, which of course has morphed since then and branched out. And we're only talking about not even really 100 years yet, although there's these styles of music you mentioned that go back as far as a few hundred years BC. And the fact that they're still around, the fact that they're still part of tradition and culture and useful, I think says so much about it.
And the other thing about those is that they haven't really changed that much in that time. Obviously they've developed, but they've not, when you kind of look back, as you have just done, at the kind of, development of modern music, what you're noticing is that every few years there's a huge directional change, and then more things offshoot from each of those new things that grow. So you end up with an infinite kind of expansion of styles. Whereas if you look at classical Indian music, it's not really ever done that as such. It's always developed and changed with the technique of playing the tabla, for example, changed radically with the invention of the microphone. So the tablas used to be much bigger. The playing used to be much more open and slow. But if we look at the actual musical style and the tradition and a lot of the rhythmic compositions, that they go back, it's not really changed that much at all. So if you can imagine, you had a set, let's say bebop, for example. Let's just take bebop, and we say, okay, we're going to get bebop and we're going to develop that for 1,000 years. So each great bebop player, Charlie Parker or, different whoever, is going to teach to their students and their students and their students. And you see how that would develop. You can't imagine what it would be like, the
Right.
virtuosity. And the thing about it is that one of the crucial things with the Indian system is that they've made a framework to pin virtuosity on. See, and we've not necessarily done that as a formal part of our music making. Maybe some of it's song based or theme based. In jazz you'd have a theme and then you'd have solos and stuff like that, whereas the actual whole structure of North and South Indian music is really all about having frameworks which give both the percussion player and the melody player opportunities to solo and demonstrate their virtuosity and also their in-depth knowledge of the music and the traditions.
Very interesting, very enlightening as well. You mentioned earlier how when we